Tadbhaktaya Mahom Vishnu Padaya Krishna Prasthaya Bhutale Srimate Bhaktivedanta Swami Purane Namaste Saraswati Deve Gauravani Pracharine Nirvishesha Shrinavari Ashtatade Satarine Yam Pravajantam Manupetya Apetya Kritam Rapayano Vidakatara Ajuhava Bhutete Tanmayataya Taravo Vinedus Tam Sarvabhutam Hridayam Murimanatosmi Bhaktya Vihina Aparada Lakshale Kiptashta Kamari Taranga Madhye Kripa Maitvam Sharanam Prapanam Vinde Namaste Charanara Vindam. Don't turn this over, just this. That's it. Narayanam Namaskritya Naram Chaiva Narottamam Devam Saraswatam Vyasam Tato Jayam Mudiraya Abhatya Vihina Aparada Lakshaya Kitashta Kamari Taranga Madhye Kripa Maitvam Sharanam Prapanna Vinde Namaste Charanara Vindam Tavevasmi Najivami Tvaya Vina Iti Vidyaya Radhe Tvam Nayanam Charanandite Vancha Kalpatarubhascha Kripa Sindhuvevacha Patitanam Pavanebhyo Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namaha. So, we are going to attempt to say some words of glorification and remembrance of our beloved Guru, Srila A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Maharaj, Srila Prabhupada. This is the day of his appearance. It's also the Nandotsava day. Nandotsava is the great celebration of Nanda Maharaj, of the birth of his son, just a few hours before midnight, last night. And it's described that the charity that Nanda Maharaj gave on that day was so great that all the Kalpavriksha trees, and all the goddesses of fortune, everybody in the spiritual world that was known for giving charity lost their power to give charity. Everything was in the hands of Nanda Maharaj on that day. And the descriptions in the Nanda Vrindavan Champu, Gopal Champu, extraordinary amounts of charity that he was giving. But we can also say that perhaps the greatest bit of charity that is given on Nandotsava day was the appearance of Srila A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada, because that charity was to ultimately benedict the entire world and the entire universe. Because in the history of the spreading of Gaudiya Vaishnavism, not since the time of Mahaprabhu himself did we ever witness such an extraordinary expansion of that mercy. Never. And perhaps for people not born in the West, it's very difficult to imagine or even remotely understand what Srila Prabhupada actually accomplished in his 11 years that he spent preaching since the time he first went to the West to the time he went back to India, back to Vrindavan, and then engaged in his disappearance pastimes. The condition of the West, the condition of the world, you can understand a little bit of it if you look at modern India. If you've lived long enough to see the transformation and the degradation of India, even in the last 40 or 50 years, the disappearance of religious values, religious principles, the incredible onslaught of materialism, the madness, the mad pursuit of material happiness, the degradation of the quality of life in every direction. What we see in India today is still just a very minor hint of what existed in the Western world at the time that Srila Prabhupada went to it. In the West, 1965 in America, I was 15 years old. Bhagavat Maharaj was 15 years old. We have a very clear idea of how ignorant and how degraded and how lost Western culture was. Absolutely no knowledge of the soul, no knowledge of God. They would speak of God, but had no knowledge of Him. Everyone was eating meat 3 times a day. Intoxication of all kinds, illicit sex, gambling, these things, the idea of a vegetarian, not even remotely heard of. There were a few small groups that practiced this, but they were considered crackpots, oddballs, very outliers in society. Just completely lost and degraded dark civilization. And this is what Srila Prabhupada was going to travel to. By himself, alone, unknown, no friends, no money. He went, and when he got off the shore, off the boat, he had 45 rupees in his pocket. And 45 rupees at that time was worth about $6 American. But you couldn't exchange. India was not on the international exchange. So even that 45 rupees was useless. It had no value. And he had 2 possible connections. Anyway, I want to back up a bit. In order to glorify one's spiritual master, Srila Bhaktivedanta Narayana Swami Maharaj said that we should speak of a few things in particular. 1, his lineage. Who was his guru? What was his line? And in relationship to that, what was his mission? What did he come to teach? And understanding and studying his life, what was his manubhishta? We can analyze his pastimes, we can talk about his interactions, but without knowing his spiritual lineage, the teachings that he came to present, and his own very specific mission, because different great personalities sometimes have different specific missions. Like Rupa Goswami, he had a very specific mission given by Mahaprabhu. Nityananda Prabhu had a very specific mission. Narottam, Srinivas, Shyamananda Prabhu, they are known for particular activities, very specific orders by their gurus. So what was Srila Prabhupada's very specific mission? So, there are many ways to approach this. We can look at his pranam mantras, the mantras that we pray that reveal. Generally, the pranam mantra to the guru is written by disciples who have come to some maturity and by association and following the order of Sri Guru have come to understand something of his mission. When you read the pranam mantras of Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Prabhupada, these were written by his disciples. They're very advanced. They have an understanding of his identity and his glories. But Srila Prabhupada's disciples had no such understanding. Srila Prabhupada wrote his own pranam mantra. Namaste Saraswati Deve Gaudavani Pracharine Nirvishesha Shunyavadi Pastatadesha Tarine. And by the mercy of Srila Bhaktivedanta Narayana Maharaj, he very kindly unpacked that and revealed much of what that mantra meant. If you just look at it in a general way, you might not understand the profundity, the depth of that mantra and what it reveals. First of all, Namaste Saraswati Devi. He identifies himself first and foremost as a disciple, therefore a follower of the mission of Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Prabhupada. So, if you want to understand something in depth about Srila Prabhupada, it behooves you to study the life and teachings of Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Prabhupada. What did he do? What did he do? Who was his guru? What was his order? What was his personal mission? Namaste Saraswati Deve, Gaudavani Pracharine. He came to preach the message of Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. And this is something which was very strong in his life, very strong in the life of Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Prabhupada, and very strong in the life of Srila Prabhupada. Prior to the appearance of Bhaktivinoda Thakur and his teachings and how they were put into concrete evangelical form by Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Prabhupada, Vaishnavism in the late 19th and early 20th century was characterized mostly by people who are practicing solitary bhajan. Even the authentic Vaishnavas. There are many who were bogus Vaishnavas, who are representing themselves as Vaishnavas, but actually quite bogus. They're simply chanting in one place and taking money from others. Sometimes they would go and do some program at a funeral or something like that, and they would take money, and they're concerned with their own bhajan. They would go to Radhakund, do bhajan, and exploit, innocent people. But the conception of preaching was not there. And even those Vaishnavas that were authentic, most of them were hidden. And they were chanting, but the message and the revelations that are meant to come from that chanting, they were not engaged in dispersing them. But Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Prabhupada, he established a revolution. And he was not very satisfied with those who simply sat and chant and did bhajan. He discouraged that. He said that bhajan is revealed through seva. And this is the motto of the Gaudiya Math. If you look at all of the great acharyas and all the great disciples coming from Srila Saraswati Prabhupada, they stressed seva and chanting. Srila Bhaktivedanta Narayan Maharaj said, first you do your Guru Seva, then you do your chanting. He didn't minimize the chanting, he didn't reduce it, but he said that you must do the Seva in order to get realization in your bhajan. And what is the Seva? Gauravani Prachadine, the preaching of the message of Mahaprabhu actively. There was one very prominent, well-known disciple of Srila Saraswati Prabhupada who was a bhajaniya. And he spent a lot of time doing bhajan. And Srila Saraswati Prabhupada had an affection for him because he was a powerful personality. And he requested Bhakti Rakshak Sridhar Maharaj that you please encourage him to come out of the forest and away from his chanting and do preaching, because he could be very effective and powerful in that role. And he maintained that by that preaching, Srila Bhakti Pragyan Keshav Goswami Maharaj said that this, used to say that preaching the message of Mahaprabhu is kirtan. It is bhajan. This is the bhajan of the modern Gaudiya Vaishnava. This is the mission. Gauravani Prachadine. This was what Mahaprabhu taught. His foremost disciple, who was his foremost follower? Nityananda Prabhu. And how did he engage Nityananda Prabhu? You go and travel, you go and preach all over Bengal. Even during the time of Rath Yatra, he would sometimes send him away and tell him, you don't have to come to Rath Yatra with everybody else, so just continue to preach. And in our line also, Bhakti Pragyan Keshav Maharaj had very powerful disciples. The devotee who was later to become the Acharya, Srila Bhaktivedanta Vamana Maharaj, would travel and preach continually. When one time he came back for the Gaur Purnima festival in Navadvip, Srila Bhakti Pragyan Keshav Maharaj said, what are you doing here? Go back and continue to preach. So, Gauravani Prachadine. So, Srila Prabhupada, if you read all of his writings and all of his teachings, this was his mood and this was his practice. He certainly stressed serious study, and he certainly stressed quality, attentive chanting. And he encouraged his disciples to chant a lot of rounds, although he did offer them the opportunity for a minimum of 16 rounds. His early disciples he tried to chant 64. They said, oh, we could never do that. 32. 16 minimum. 16 minimum. with the understanding that perhaps later in their life, when they became mature and developed some taste for Harinam, they would be able to increase their chanting. But the preaching, this is what he wanted. And those of us that were alive and his disciples at that time can attest to the power of his determination and his constant exhortation to preach, to distribute books, to spread this message. And by that, anyone who took that up can also relate to the power and the energy that they received by that. There's something extraordinary that we constantly hear about association with Sri Guru. There are two kinds of association. Physical or direct, being in the direct presence of Sri Guru is Vapu, but then there's also, we're told, the Vani, hearing the instruction of Sri Guru and being connected by that. And all of our gurus have said that Vani is more important than Vapu. That's a hard thing to understand, because we know from our personal experience that we get a lot of enthusiasm and inspiration in the personal association of Sri Guru. Do we not? We certainly do. And we get to observe and see how they behave, how they interact. This is very instructive. But one of the remarkable elements of Srila Prabhupada's mission and his preaching, that the majority of his disciples did not get very much personal association at all. Bhagavad Maharaj mentioned himself, me also, thousands of others. When Srila Prabhupada would come, we would get to sit in class and maybe go on a morning walk once or twice in our life. But to sit in a room and have intimate darshan, to do intimate service, to sit and talk, this opportunity was there in the beginning for his early disciples. And you can read about those. I spent many hours yesterday reading some recollections of one of our god sisters, Govinda Dasi. And she wrote about her about her recollections of her time with Srila Prabhupada back in 1967. And I met her for the first time last year in Austin, Texas. She was there. And I was doing programs every night at the house that she was staying at. And a very delightful person. She's just a few years older than us. But that was a big deal back in those days, because a few years older meant you met Srila Prabhupada a few years earlier. So she met him in San Francisco in 1967, and then stayed with him in New York, again in the West Coast, in Hawaii. They opened up a temple in Seattle, and she had so many remarkable stories. And I'd be giving class, and all of a sudden she'd blurt something out about Srila Prabhupada. And then she'd start talking. And I'd just stop and let her talk. And she'd go on, and this wave of remembrance would come. And the remembrances, it's very interesting, because if you read her remembrances now, she's remembering through the eyes of a 21-year-old girl, meeting Srila Prabhupada for the first time. What kind of realization can you have? What can you understand about your guru at that time? Not so much. But one thing that came very clearly was the extraordinary sense of love and compassion and concern that he had for her, for her husband, for all of these new devotees. Jadharani, Shamarani is mentioned, others that you might know. And Srila Prabhupada's very kind and fatherly dealings with all of them. Very patient, always encouraging. Even under very trying circumstances. His health was frail, he had strokes, and yet he was always looking out, considering the welfare of his disciples, and pushing on the preaching as best he could, even with his failing body. Even in 1967, he was having difficulty. And this would periodically plague him for the next 10 years, but never stopping. Even when he was lying down, preparing to leave his body in Vrindavan, there are films of him continuing to preach to his disciples. continuing to encourage them. Gaudavani Prachadane and Nirvishesh Shunyavadi, trying to eliminate the horrible seeds, the deep-seated roots of impersonalism and voidism that contaminate the soul in the Kali Yuga, that prevent them from approaching and embracing the conception of a loving, compassionate God. This is something that's so far away, was so far away in the Western mind. At the time Srila Prabhupada appeared, the big magazines in America, the Time magazine was the most popular magazine in America. One of the covers was, "Is God Dead?" Because in America there's such a mentality of nihilism, of discouragement, of darkness. The world is so unfortunate. And at that time he came to show the light. He had his Back to Godhead magazine, the motto, "Godhead is light, nescience and ignorance is darkness. Where there is God, there is no darkness." But how are we to see that light? Who is the torchbearer? Who is the proof that there is a compassionate God? The proof was the walking representative, the external representative of the Lord himself, Srila Prabhupada, who showed those qualities of unremitting love and compassion. Unconditional love and compassion. There's a beautiful story Govinda Das tells. If you look in the folio, there's under, the Bhaktivedanta folio, under biographies, there's her stories, collection of stories. And she's just telling all these stories, just these little tiny stories, one after another. Vignettes, you could call them. 2 paragraphs long, one after another. And there's one, they're sitting together. Srila Prabhupada was in New Jersey, on the east coast of America. He'd had a stroke, and he said, "I need to be in the seashore, because the seashore, the sea air is very powerful." He said, "It's full of vitamins and energy. So if I go to the seashore, it'd be good for my health." So they took him to this seashore, this town, and they had a cottage that was on the beach, and every morning they would go out and sit on a blanket with them, 3 of them. Kirtananda would cook, and Govinda Dasi and Gaur Sundar, her husband, they would attend to his personal needs, clean and things like that. And every morning, she would go take a walk around the neighborhood. And that neighborhood where they were living, that town, everybody was growing roses. Everybody grew roses. And so all this summer, in the summer, the whole town just smelled of all kinds of roses. And she knew that Srila Prabhupada liked roses. So she would go walking around, and she'd talk to the people who had these bushes, and they're very happy to give her all the roses she wanted. That somebody appreciated their roses, they were happy. And she said, "Yes, my grandfather is sick. He's here, and he really loves roses, and it will help him feel better. Can I have some roses?" She said, "Yes, take all you want." So every day she would come back with 2 big bags of roses, and then she'd put them in vases all around Srila Prabhupada's room and out in the little sitting room. The whole house would be filled with roses from the smell. And Srila Prabhupada said, "Oh, these are very good." He'd take big handfuls of roses and put his face in them. And he said, "Oh, these are very healing, very good." And what was he doing? Well, he was giving some simple instruction in a delightful way, but he was also reciprocating and accepting whatever she had. He was giving his love and appreciating her gift. I remember hearing the other day, Gurudev was talking about that if we give a gift to somebody, and think about giving a gift to a guru, and they appreciate it, and they say, "Oh, this is so nice what you've done," and they accept it, and they're very effusive in their gratitude. Our heart swells with joy at this reciprocation, right? Oh, and we want to do more, and we want to do more. Srila Prabhupada was like that with his disciples. Whatever you could offer, he would accept with the greatest happiness and joy And this would fill you with greater enthusiasm to do more seva. There's so many little stories like that. And I'm going to get back to the Vani and Vapu because this relates to that, but I want to tell one little side story about his compassion. And they're sitting on the blanket on the seashore, and they're looking at all these little living entities at the seashore, the little crabs, little bugs, and Srila Prabhupada's inquiring very intently about all these things and talking about the poor conditioned souls. And then one slug starts crawling into the Vindadas. You know what a slug is? It's like a snail. Those snails, and then there's that slimy thing with the shell, and they walk, and it's all mucus and everything, and they're very disgusting. And then she's starting to inch away from it. And Srila Prabhupada looks, and he said he bent his head over and was looking very intently at that snail, at that slug. And he said, this poor jiva, you should chant to her. Chant the Maha Mantra. And she begins to chant. And the slug stops, and then it turns around and starts going back the other way. And she said, no, she's very new, you know. Devotees, they weren't even wearing saris or anything yet. She was in blue jeans and, you know, shirts and stuff like that. And hippie clothes. And yet, this simple message and this obvious quality of deep compassion, not just to people, not just to rich people that could give us something, not to somebody that could offer something, but and not just to Indians or to people from my own group, but to a slug, a snail, because he could see, she could understand, he had spiritual vision. I remember taking a walk with Srila Bhaktivedanta Narayan Goswami Maharaj in Badger, California, in this farmland, and we'd always walk on this path, and nearby was a field with cows that were all destined for slaughter. And every day we would walk, and he would tell the devotees to chant very loudly. And because these cows, so they're very afraid, they wouldn't even come near people, because they knew what their fate was. But one day he said, chant very loud so that the grass and the creepers and the trees and all the insects will also hear. We're just walking there, looking at the sunshine and the trees and seeing Gurudev and each other, completely oblivious, and he's seeing all the living entities conditioned in these bodies and feeling compassion and telling us to chant. This was Srila Prabhupada's mood. This is what he had come for. This is what he had come, Gauravani Prachadine, and to remove Nirvishesh Shunyavadi, Paschata Deshatadine, the ignorance, the darkness of Mayavad and impersonalism. So, how else do we know his, Vani and Vapu? I want to tie that in. So, we're talking about the exchange of love. Anybody who would offer something, he would be so happy and grateful to receive it, genuinely. And he would speak to that and encourage. So, how did Srila Prabhupada do this worldwide movement if most of us didn't get that kind of personal exchange? You said you got some prasad from his hand once. Me too, once, directly from his hand. Wasn't one of these little kids that would get a cookie every day. You know, we were off in the background. We didn't get to do so much personal service, but we got to serve in separation. But what was that service? We would go out chanting the holy name on the streets. We would go out with book bags and to remote towns, remote corners of the country where there were no temples. One time we traveled in a van for an entire year. We went 75,000 miles in 1 year, traveling from place to place to place. And in that time, we visited a temple a total of 3 days. We had our own little temple in the van. No deities, no nothing. But every day we were distributing books. But the remarkable thing is that we felt so connected with Srila Prabhupada. There were so many times of difficulty, of trial and error, but the more the difficulty, if we surrendered, the greater the sense of connection. This is Vani. And Srila Prabhupada's remarkable speciality, I would say, was that he was able to infuse his disciples, no matter how neophyte, no matter how beginner that we were, we could feel that connection by even the most meager of services. And we had that enthusiasm. How is it possible that devotees who had met him a few times only, lived in a temple maybe for a year or two or less, some devotees that we had with us had never lived in a temple. They joined a van, or they joined a bus, and they went around. I had a van full of guys that had never lived in a temple. And we just traveled around. I was the very senior guy because I'd been there for 3 years, right? So, yeah. But we had that connection. And we were infused. We understood his Manubhishta. I remember in Vrindavan in 1976, we had the opportunity to be with Srila Prabhupada for an entire month. And we get to hear his class every single day, every morning. And I remember one time in Vrindavan in particular, this was at the end of the time, last week, and he was in a particularly fiery mood. Sometimes during the lecture he would tell a funny story. I remember when he told the Punar Mustika Baba story about the mouse becoming a cat, and then a dog, and then a tiger, and then back to the mouse again. And he could put everybody in tremendous hasa-ras, laughter. But this one time now, he was feeling the spirit and the determination to convey to his disciples his desire. And I remember him saying this. He was sitting on that seat. If you go into Krishna Balaram temple, his Vyasasan is there. And he was sitting there. You know, I'm thinking that it was a little bit over at that time. Not quite where it is now. But anyway, he was sitting there. And we're all there. And he's giving a very powerful lecture. And then all of a sudden, he starts roaring. And he said, "Sword Krishna! Distribute book! Distribute book!" And he was roaring. And I remember practically falling backwards from the power of that statement. And at the same time, not feeling at all guilty or unhappy by hearing that, but by feeling very happy to know what did my guru want and what could I do to make him happy. And that's what a disciple wants. So we have a responsibility not just to do the seva, but to study deeply the example of our guru. What did our guru do? How did he live? What was his life dedicated to? And Srila Prabhupada made the point from the very first time he met his guru in 1921, Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Prabhupada, Srila Prabhupada said what to him? He said, "You are a very intelligent young man. You're very good in English. You should preach this message in English to the Western world." And Srila A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada did not meet him or see his guru directly again for another 10 years until Vrindavan Parikram 1931 at Koshi. However, he absorbed that message, and he was always thinking, I have met such a very nice sadhu, and he wants to preach this message. I want to do this on his behalf. He took that into his heart, and he began to follow his instruction, chanting rounds, following all the principles which he was doing anyway from birth. But he also began to assist the Gaudiya Math in Allahabad, introducing them to people. He formed a preaching team. He made the introductions, and other different devotees would take different roles. But he was very, very active, such that when Srila Saraswati Prabhupada did come in, temple, I can't remember. Anyway, he came for that, and they wanted to introduce him to their star, you know, this is our best man, and we're bringing him to you for initiation. But Srila Prabhupada had already noted him from seeing him in Kashi, and from the meeting, Koshi, and from the meeting in 1921. And from those two meetings, just as our Srila Prabhupada had accepted him in his heart and fully dedicated his life to fulfilling his desire, so Srila Saraswati Prabhupada said, yes, I know him. I have noted him. He hears very carefully. He hears very carefully. And what does that mean? It means not just the lectures and the tattva and the siddhanta and all the explanations, being able to repeat that, but he heard my desire, my manobhishta, what I want to do. He is tadatmik with me. He is my near and dear. And of course he gave him initiation. But he had been initiated from the first time he met him. They had made that connection. So now, 1965, so many years later, 44 years later, Srila Prabhupada had now crossed the ocean to fulfill the order of his Guru Maharaj, and he had arrived, he was about to arrive at the Boston Harbor. He was just 4 days out from arriving on the shores of America. All the anticipation, all the planning, all the writing, everything that he had done for all these years, the translation of Srimad Bhagavatam. He had no money, no friends, but he had trunks of books that he was prepared to introduce to the Western world. He had faith in these books. Why? Why books? Because his Guru Maharaj had told him, you know, oh, I spent so much money and time building temples, and now they're causing so many problems, these temples. They're fighting in the temples, they're arguing, you know. I should have just printed books. Maybe I should tear down the temple and sell the marble and just print books. You know, he was showing. And Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Prabhupada had also, just before the passing of Bhaktivinoda Thakur, he had sent a message to his son and disciple and said, Saraswati, he had instructed him, now I want you to take up very seriously the service of Sridham Mayapur. And the service of Sridham Mayapur is accomplished by the distribution of transcendental literatures, these transcendental books. So you should print, as I have done, because Bhaktivinoda Thakur dedicated himself to translating and writing so much. Continue that and distribute. So our Srila Prabhupada made it his life's mission to distribute his books. And those of us who engage in that during his lifetime felt this connection that will never go away. It will never go away. Because Srila Prabhupada, this was, as I said, this is speciality. That just as when Nityananda Prabhu and Mahaprabhu, when they traveled throughout India, wherever they met, they would infuse within them prema, directly, fully, or the seed of prema, and then whoever that person met, they would go and infuse them as well, whoever they met. And then whoever that person met, then they would go. And this is exactly how Srila Prabhupada's mission was spread. You read about brand new people that had been in his association for 6 months or a year. He'd tell them, now you've been with me enough, go out and start a temple. And preaching centers were done all over America like that. And then Canada. And then England. And then Europe. They came back to India. They went to Russia. They went to China. They went to the Muslim countries. Srila Prabhupada said, whoever takes this message to the countries of Muhammad, Mahaprabhu will certainly take him back in this lifetime. He was so grateful for the sacrifice. Africa, devotees lost their lives preaching. Some of them lost their lives. But this was his dedication. Srila Prabhupada was prepared to give up his own life. And he almost did on the journey over. He suffered 2 heart attacks. And again, as we mentioned earlier, throughout his sojourn for the next 10 and 12 years, there are many very difficult times with his health. So what did he say? We don't have a whole lot of time, but we can get a little insight. Offering's over? I'm going to read this one verse then. There are 2 poems that he wrote. This is the poem he wrote before he arrived. He's now, you can't imagine the anticipation he must feel. He's been on the boat for a month, and he's been preparing for 45 years. And now he's just a few days away from arriving in America. And he writes this verse. He writes, I'll just read the English, although he writes it in Bengali. He's a beautiful poet. He wrote many beautiful songs. I emphatically say to you, O brothers, you will obtain your good fortune from the Supreme Lord Krishna only when Srimati Radharani becomes pleased with you. So, that's the general translation. Even the general translation is quite remarkable. He's exhorting and speaking to everyone that if you want the grace of Lord Krishna, you have to attain the favor of Srimati Radhika. So what is he saying? Which Krishna? He's talking about our goal, our aspiration is that Krishna in Vrindavan with Srimati Radhika. Not Dwarka Krishna, not Mathura Krishna, not Lord Ram. We don't minimize Krishna's appearance in any of these other forms, but Mahaprabhu came to give this. And this is the very first thing he's writing. But Bhakti-Rakshak Sridhar Maharaj said something else about this poem. He said that actually Srila Prabhupada is speaking to Krishna directly. He's calling Krishna by. Krishna tava punya habe by, e punya koribe jabe, Radharani kushi habe, Dhruva ati bale tamatai. He says, he's speaking to Krishna, O brother, you will obtain your good fortune when Srimati Radhika becomes pleased with you. The nature of the poetic writings of our acharyas is that they have many levels of meanings. And Bhakti-Rakshak Sridhar himself said that this is another way of looking at this poem, that he's in a very deep mood right now. And he's talking to Krishna and telling him, you should try very hard to please Srimati Radhika. And then he says, then he goes into Sri Srimad Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur, who is very dear to Lord Gauranga, the son of Mother Shachi, is unparalleled in his service to the Supreme Lord Sri Krishna. He is that great saintly spiritual master who bestows intense devotion to Krishna at different places throughout the world. He's identifying his guru as a great associate of Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu and as a worldwide preacher. By a strong desire, by my guru's strong desire, the holy name of Lord Gauranga will spread throughout all the countries of the Western world, in all the cities, towns, and villages on the earth, from all the oceans, seas, rivers, and streams. Everyone will chant the holy name of Krishna. As the vast mercy of Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu conquers all directions, a flood of transcendental ecstasy will certainly cover the land. When all the sinful, miserable living entities become happy, the Vaishnava's desire is then fulfilled. This is his mood now. He is in the ecstasy, transcendental ecstasy, anticipating the preaching mission. Right? Seeking the mercy of Srimati Radhika, of his Gurudev. He says, although my Guru Maharaj ordered me to accomplish this mission, I am not worthy or fit to do it. I am very fallen and insignificant. Therefore, O Lord, now I am begging for your mercy, so that I may become worthy for you, are the wisest and most experienced of all. If you bestow your power, by serving the spiritual master, one attains the absolute truth. One's life becomes successful. If that service is obtained, then one becomes happy and gets your association due to good fortune. So he's speaking like that to Krishna, glorifying his Guru, seeking the mercy of Krishna to get the mercy of his Guru, seeking the mercy of his Guru to get the mercy of Krishna. And then he says, "O Lord Krishna, you are my eternal companion. Forgetting you, I have suffered the kicks of Maya birth after birth. If today the chance to meet you occurs again, then I will surely be able to rejoin you." And then he says, "O dear friend, in your company I will experience great joy once again. In the early morning I will wander about the cowherd pastures and fields, running and frolicking in the many forests of Braj. I will roll on the ground in spiritual ecstasy. Oh, when will that day be mine? Today, that remembrance of you came to me in a very nice way, sitting in the boat. Because I have a great longing, I call to you. I am your eternal servant, and therefore I desire your association so much. O Lord Krishna, except for you, there is no other means of success." This could have been written by Bhaktivinoda Thakur, by Narottam Das. It's such a beautiful prayer. You could spend hours and hours dissecting this. But I just wanted to read it to infuse our minds and hearts with the potency of his direct words. And now, in conclusion, we just simply beg for a particle of mercy of that great, great soul on his appearance day, that a speck of his compassion and his fervor for the service of his Guru and Mahaprabhu and Srimati Radhika and Sri Krishna, a speck of that dust fall on our heads, and then we become most fortunate. So this day is filled with good potency for that, and so we honor and glorify and beg for the mercy of Srila A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada. Jai. All praise Srila.